Hi, welcome to the YouTube channel World Famous in New Zealand. I called it World Famous in New Zealand because that's a bit of a joke in New Zealand, and I'm from New Zealand, but I live in the US. This channel is aimed to entertain you and inform you and give you some insights and knowledge that you may not have, and try and be as impartial as possible. And the day today, or the 4th of October 2023, is when I've decided I was going to have a good long chat with you about what the channel is all about. And then hopefully it can give you more and more information in the future as we move forward. So there's going to be a lot of focus on climate and climate news and some choices by certain politicians or political parties around climate and climate change, countries' choices. And every now and then we might segue out to some entertaining characters from New Zealand that are around the world that you may not know are from New Zealand. So that's why they're world famous in New Zealand, because they're world famous, but only people in New Zealand know that they're from New Zealand. Hence the title. But let's be clear, I'm not world famous in New Zealand or even famous in New Zealand. I'm just a guy. So let's jump straight into it. And we'll start today. We're going to talk about the United Nations, the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015, and some sustainable development goals that the UN or the United Nations put together. So first I'm going to give you a brief overview of the United Nations, and it's called the UN, and it was founded in June the 26th, 1945 in San Francisco in the USA. That was when the founding document was signed, and that founding document is called the UN Charter. So that was a charter, and this was a monumental event that came after the United Nations Conference. The United Nations Conference came about after World War II, and it was an international organization. Basically, officially, they took effect on the 24th of October 1945. And so what was the UN Charter? We need to focus on the significance of what this is. The UN Charter is no ordinary document. This was an international treaty signed by governments worldwide, and it empowers the UN to address a whole wide range of global issues. So it's kind of like the rule book for international relations for countries. And it emphasizes principles like sovereign equality, peaceful dispute resolution, and refraining from using force. So I imagine this dates back to some of the issues we have now around colonialization, as an example. So the amendments to the United Charter, obviously it's going to evolve over time. That was in 1945, and the membership numbers. So the current membership numbers are 193 countries as of July 2023. So the UN Charter has evolved a few times during that time. In 1963 it changed a little bit, in 1965, and in 1973. And when we talk about 193 nations, more member countries, some would classify that as almost all of the world. It depends on how you define a country in the world. There is different definitions for it. So there's 193 countries as member states according to the UN, and they position themselves as the authority on countries, but they also recognize two observer states, so the Vatican City, which is within Rome and Italy, as an observer state of its own, and then Palestine, which are self-ruling non-territories, but not fully fledged countries. But then that's controversial, because then you're not including countries that could potentially be classified as a country, but then there's contentiousness around that. So Taiwan, for example, is a self-governed territory, but China claims it to be part of China. So that Taiwan was actually a member of the UN until 1971, but it's now considered part of mainland China, which I imagine they would probably dispute. Similar to Kosovo as being part of Serbia. So some of these places in the world where there's been conflict over years, and this is why there's those issues around how you classify a country. And then there's also countries like Northern Cyprus and the Cook Islands, which uses New Zealand currency, for example, and has New Zealand government decisions, but it governs itself on its own islands, which is similar to Greenland. Greenland is a massive island north of the Atlantic in the Arctic Ocean, probably one of the ones that you'd think would be affected by climate change the most, and it should be its own country, but it's not a UN member, it's not a UN country at all, and it manages their own domestic affairs, or I say it, Greenland, the people of Greenland manage their own domestic affairs, but they're actually ultimately controlled by the government from Denmark, which is interesting, which is a European country which is considerably smaller, but has a really strong relationship and positive relationship, and is monitoring that. So yeah, I mean the US CIA, the United States CIA fact book lists 237 countries. So there's other parts of the world that are disputed still to define it, but 193 countries across the globe is a pretty solid agreement of people and governments agreeing that they need to help protect the world. So that's when we're going to transition from that and talk about the UN and why that body is so important and powerful and what they're talking about and those leaders. And then talk about the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is in 2015. Paris Agreement is a pivotal moment for international cooperation, because that is when in 2015, when the leaders gathered in Paris for COP21, which is called the Coalition of Parties, they reached this historic Paris Agreement. And what they're saying there is that climate change knows no borders. It doesn't matter where you live in the world, climate change is going to impact you and affect you. And if you don't believe so, some people can just walk outside and have a look now, and others can see it on the news. It's pretty damning across the world now, and it really needs to change for the better of the future generations. Not necessarily how we're living now as much as you'd think. It is for sure impacting us now, but it's only going to get worse and impact people a lot more in the future. So your future generations, your children and grandchildren, we want them to live in a positive and happy and clean world. And it's not looking that way right now. So this treaty, the Paris Agreement, was a groundbreaking treaty. It set ambitious goals by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and limiting the rise of temperature by 1.5 degrees Celsius. Celsius is the global measurement for temperature rather than Fahrenheit, which is used in the US. Majority of the world use Celsius for temperature. It's questionable. Americans may question this, but it's more accurate than Fahrenheit for measuring temperature. So what they're saying there is we can't have the temperature in the world, the average temperature in Celsius in the world, rise by more than 1.5 degrees by 2030. So 1.5 might sound small in Celsius, but it's not. It's a big change, and it will have major impacts across the world. And there's also an obligation from those countries to provide financial support to developing countries to help fight climate change. So the significance of this Paris Agreement then, when we're talking about it, this is a legally binding document, and it officially kicked into effect on 2016, November 2016, and almost all of the nations signed it. It was 124 nations to be exact, because the European Union, which is all the individual countries in Europe as part of the European Union, signed it as a union as well. Excuse me. So they joined this as a global effort. This was something that we need to make sure this comes into effect, and for it to come into effect, countries had to ratify the agreement. So when they signed the agreement, they still had to say, yes, we're backing this agreement, and we're going to step up our forces here, and we're going to say at least 55 countries accounting for 55% of all global greenhouse gas emissions have to ratify the document, and it's basically co-signing it and signing it again to make sure that agreement entered into force, and that was done in 2016. So big hats off. There was 15 parties in particular, or countries in the world, that raced ahead to make sure they did that. Countries like Belize, Barbados, Fiji. You imagine a lot of these countries that are very cautious about this, the ones where the rising sea levels can impact their country the most. So, but it's not just about reducing emissions. The Paris Agreement was more broadly focused across a number of issues. So it's about building resilience and transparency. Developed nations in the world, like the US, countries in Europe, they have to assist developing nations and help invest in developing nations, and make sure there's rigorous monitoring to ensure that everyone is staying on track, so that we're not just saying, yeah, we're going to get that done, don't worry, and then nothing happens, which is kind of happening. Not entirely, but a little bit. Right, so what are the nuts and bolts of the Paris Agreement? What does it mean? Well, basically they created a rule book. And so each year, that COP, the Coalition of Parties, the UN have a new Coalition of Parties every year, and they come back together and they review things. And they created a rule book, which was finalized only in 2021. So 6 years after the first agreement was signed. And what they were talking about there is making sure that we had sustainable development goals. And so what we're going to do now is talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. And they said this was actually done in 2015. The Sustainable Development Goals were laid out, but they need to be an agenda up to 2030. So the UN members in 2015 set out 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And so these SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, were aimed to create a better world for everyone. So it's a call to action to end poverty, improve health, education, reduce inequality, address climate change, and all the while preserving the environment and making the world a better place. So they're very ambitious goals for some of them, and some of them are common sense, and they should have been done a long time ago. And I think that this is part of the world evolving and changing, and people coming together a lot more than they used to. So the United Nations Paris Agreement and then the Sustainable Development Goals are all part of humanity's shared effort to make the world a better place. That's what I would describe it as. And it's remind us that for global challenges, we need global solutions. You can't just say, oh, the big country over there needs to do a lot more, or that country over there, they're more wealthy than us, they need to do a lot more, or they can do their own thing. It's 193 countries around the world saying we need to do better for all of the world together. And there's varying degrees of what you can and can't do according to the wealth and development of those countries, but everyone has to put in their bit. So what is the Sustainable Development Goals, and what is the climate ambition? What is the climate ambition? What are we talking about there? So they laid out this ambitious plan with those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm going to tell you what they are. So those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, I hope this is a drinking game for you guys. There's a range of critical issues, right? So what we're going to do is take a look at those: ending poverty, gender equality, cleaner water, taking action on climate change. So let's list them one by one. So number 1, no poverty, end poverty everywhere. Boom. Ambitious statement, right? Ambitious. It should be. It's something we should have and want, but it's a big challenge across countries all over the world. Even developed countries have some level of poverty, and they want to end that across the world. Number 2, zero hunger. Ensure food security and sustainable agriculture. So that's making sure the farms are delivering, food consistently and making it sustainable, and making sure that everyone in the world that is hungry can be fed. Good health and well-being, just basic. Promote health for all ages. Number 4, quality education. Provide a quality education for all. Doesn't matter who you are, you deserve the right to a quality education. Gender equality, so empowering women and girls, which has been an imbalance historically as well. Clean water and sanitation. Ensure access to clean water and sanitation for all people. Everyone deserves the right to be able to have a shower and a bath and go to the restroom in a clean and sanitary place. Affordable and clean energy. Provide sustainable and modern energy that the world can use. Decent work and economic growth. So promote economic growth and decent work, which is ironic. It's almost replicating exactly what they've said. But yeah, so giving people the chance to work and promoting economic growth to help develop countries. Then we have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Industry, innovation and infrastructure. So we need to look at building resilient infrastructure and foster innovation. Number 10 is reduced inequalities. Reduce inequality within and among countries. So not just saying there's inequality in this country and they need to sort it out. We also need to look at the inequalities for countries around the world comparatively to others and try to balance that out to some degree. I think it's possible. To some degrees, I think it's very hard. But there should be a reduction in inequality as much as we can possibly deliver, and as much as humans can do to make people equal and get a fair opportunity to enjoy a healthy and happy life. Sustainable cities and communities. So what we're talking about there is creating inclusive, safe and sustainable cities. Again, I feel like some of these goals, when you look at the state of the world right now, you're thinking, whew, they put these in 2015. What are we looking at now? It's 2023. work needs to be done on some of the stuff, but I think at least they're trying. They've put these in place to say this is what we need to do, and these are the actions we need to take. These are goals. So responsible consumption and production. So promoting sustainable consumption and production. I think that's improving a lot, but needs work too. Climate action, taking urgent action to combat climate change. Life below the water. So conserving oceans and marine resources. I think that needs some more work too. Life on land, protect terrestrial ecosystems and biodiversity. So what does that mean? That's like the mangroves on a coastline. It could mean swamplands somewhere. It could mean farmland. It could mean the Amazon forest and rivers. It could mean anything across the world, different places. Need to make sure that those ecosystems and the biodiversity in those systems maintained and is protected and maintained, so that we can make sure that the world is in balance. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. So promoting peace, justice, and inclusivity. I think we should all be. I mean, they're all goals we should be trying to achieve, but I feel like some of them they're a fair way off still. Partnerships for the goals. So strengthening global partnerships where countries working together more positively and without an agenda to suit their own internal or selfish agendas, making it a global agenda and partnerships together to improve the world. So that's 17. I didn't number all of them, I'm sorry. I hope you got them in order. That's 17 sustainable development goals that we have across the world that the United Nations have put in place. And these are noble goals. They're very noble, but the world's facing a lot of challenges in achieving these. According to the World Meteorological Organization, at the half-time point, we're at the half-time point for the 2030 agenda. So that was, in 2015 they said by 2030 we need to reduce the temperature in the climate, average temperature, by 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we're a far way off track from meeting these goals. Global efforts to tackle hunger, poverty, ill health, clean water, energy, sustainable development. They were saying only 15%, according to the World Meteorological Organization, only 15% of the sustainable development goals are actually on track. So, a lot to do when it's 2023 now. That was, halfway. Yeah, we're about halfway. We need to really make some changes. And it's about water security, clean energy, better health, sustainable oceans, resilient cities. It looked at 18 different organizations and it issued this report to the UN and submitted it to the UN saying that this is what needs to be done. So what we're looking at now is this report. I'm going to talk to you about this report. And this is the latest report from July 2023 that was presented to the UN. And it talks about the Sustainable Development Goals and gives us a sad story of where the world is now after we were hitting it. So remember, number 1 was no poverty. By 2023, 575 million people in the world will still be living in extreme poverty. Number 2, zero hunger. High food prices continue to plague nations. More than 600 million people worldwide are projected to face hunger by 2030. Number 3, good health and well-being. This one is more positive. Apparently we've been making strides in this one, improving global health outcomes. 146 out of 200 countries have improved their overall health outcomes for their people and are already on track to meet the rate for underage mortality. So it used to be particularly high rates for children under 5 dying, which was not a positive thing, obviously. And they're on track or meeting these targets to improve that so that the rate of mortalities for children under 5 is particularly low compared to before. So that's a great sign. Good. There are some positive strides being made. Quality education was number 4. The world is way behind in this one. 84 million children and youth will be out of school. 300 million students will lack basic numeracy and literacy skills, and only 1 in 6 countries will achieve a universal secondary school completion target. So New Zealand is one of these countries that you'd think, we're we're a developed Western styled country that's had a lot of resource. Sadly, we have higher truancy numbers than ever before, and it's not a good place for education right now. But that's just one example. New Zealand, I mean, we're talking about worldwide. 84 million children and youth will be out of school by 2030. That's we're talking not just things like developed countries like New Zealand. We're talking countries that are developing where children are having to go to work for their families, and that happens in New Zealand as well. Probably happens in the US maybe as well. I don't know, to be honest, with the US, but these countries are not giving children education because the families can't afford to live in society, so the children are working to help their family live and survive. So it's a bad state of affairs. Gender equality. Wow. At the current rate, it will take 300 years to end child marriage, 286 years to close the gaps in legal protection and to remove discriminatory laws, and 140 years to achieve equal representation and leadership in the workplace. 140 years before there'll be a gender equal leadership position in the workplace. That's a contentious one for me personally, but I mean, I think there definitely needs to be some improvements, and there needs to be more equal opportunity for people to become leaders of businesses than there currently is, and there has been. Clean water and sanitation. So this is number 6 we're up to now. In 2022, 2.2 billion people lacked safely managed drinking water. 3.5 billion people lacked safely managed sanitation, and 2.2 billion people were unable to have basic hand washing facilities. So that was last year. 2.2 billion people. It doesn't say where these people are in the world, but I don't think it really matters, to be fair, in this concept. I think this should be something that everyone should have, and that we should, developed countries should be helping fund countries that can't create these basic sanitary facilities and clean water for humans, all humans in the world. Number 7, affordable and clean energy. Energy efficient improvements must be more than double its pace. So the annual energy intensity improvement rate that it's currently at needs to double in pace, otherwise we're not going to get there. International public financing for clean energy for developing countries is going down. So instead of developing countries spending more money on clean energy, they're spending less money on clean energy. It's actually gone down from 26 billion in 2017 to 10.8 billion in 2021. There's a number of factors for this. I think, again, New Zealand's not a developing country, but I know we spent more on coal power plants and imported more coal than we had before in recent years compared to previous years, which is, it's madness, right? We should be able to do more there. Number 8, decent work and economic growth. 1 in 4 young people are not in education, which we've talked about a little bit already. They're not in any kind of education or employment or training courses. So 1 in 4 young people. So that's not improved at all. Industry and innovation and infrastructure. This is number 9. What we were talking about here is improving energy and infrastructure. So energy-related CO2 emissions reached 36.8 billion metric tons in 2022. So that's a record high. So instead of improving and reducing them, CO2 emissions from energy-related business increased to 36.8 billion metric tons. 36.8 billion metric tons. 1 metric ton of carbon emissions is the equivalent of charging your mobile phone over 121,000 times. So that's for 1 metric ton. You'd have to charge your phone 121,000 times. And yet the world is at record highs of 36.8 billion metric tons of carbon. And that's just from energy-related emissions. So energy-related emissions means anything related to creating a power source. So number 10, reducing inequalities. In 2022, refugee numbers hit a record high of 34.6 million children. 41% of the COVID-19 triggers were largest numbers. So what we're saying there is this has been the worst it has in 3 decades. So the largest increase of inequality in the last 3 decades. It's gone backwards. In 2022, there was a record high. I mean, a lot of this can be attributed, I imagine, to the Ukraine, the war in the Ukraine. A lot of children, sadly, became refugees from that war, and still are becoming from that war. So that's why, I mean, war has negative impacts on so many levels. It's not funny. But reducing the refugee numbers, it's gone backwards. Sustainable cities and communities. So number 11, in 2020, 1.1 billion urban residents. 1.1 billion urban residents are living in slums. And by 2030, it's expected to be 3 billion. So rather than reducing that number, in the next 10 years, they're expecting billions more, 1.9 billion more people being, in a slum, living in a slum. And 3 in 4 cities have less than 20% of their area in their cities dedicated to public spaces and streets. The target in 2020, so 5 years after the Paris Agreement, the target was to have 45 to 50% of major cities having dedicated public spaces and streets. And 3 in 4 cities, 75% of the cities have less than 20% of space for that. Responsible consumption and production. Despite calls for a phase out of fossil fuels, government fossil fuel subsidies have actually doubled. So government's subsidizing fossil fuels, so they're using taxpayers' money to subsidize fossil fuel purchases and use, has doubled. So that means leaders of these governments have not been playing ball very well at all. They're saying it's triggered by a global crisis. It's up from $375 billion in 2020 to $732 billion in 2021. That's fossil fuels we're talking here. You understand we're talking, gas, petrol, fuels that are burning, Scope 1 fuels that are burning and creating emissions. It's doubled. Governments have been spending more money subsidizing it. So that's a real shocker, that one. And on average, every person in the world wastes, well, this is an average, right? Because some people don't even get this much food in a year, which is a sad thing. But on average, each person wastes 120 kilograms of food per year, food and material. So I mean, that's more than I weigh, for example. It's a good chunk more than I weigh. So 120 kilograms in pounds, calculation in my head, not great. It's about 260 pounds of food per year. That's a lot. And the material footprint of incomes is lower. So the carbon footprint of people is 10 times that of low-income countries. So the modern countries, developed countries, our carbon footprints per individual are considerably higher than those in developed countries. We're 10 times more. So we need a bigger responsibility there as well. Climate action. This is number 13 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Crikey, I've been going on these. Where we are in the world will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2035 and 2.5 degrees Celsius warming by 2100. So that's the opposite of what they wanted. The rate of sea level rise has doubled in the last decade. So the sea level on the coastline has doubled from what it was 10 years ago. That's a real worry. And then number 14, life below the water. Plastic pollution has 17 million metric tons in the ocean in 2021. That's plastic pollution that we humans are putting in the ocean, 17 million metric tons in 2021. They're estimating that's going to be 2 to 3 times more by 2040. That's sad. And then more than a third of the global fishing stocks are being overfished. So we're going to run out of fish eventually. They keep going the way they're going. There's going to be no fish left. You're going to go, oh, where's my tuna? Where's my salmon? And they're going to be like, well, we just kept fishing it until there's none left. Sorry, you guys didn't listen. No, it's gone. Coastal eutrophication, which is where algal blooms create dead zones in the sea. So This is like a whitening of coral and the coral dying. You'll see this in places like in Australia in the Great Barrier Reef, which is one of the most famous sites in the world. A beautiful place to go. They are being destroyed due to this climate change and due to the effects of the heat and the temperature and the water changing. I'm not a scientist on that one, to be fair, but the algal blooms have increased, and that has helped kill off that. And the ocean acidification, so the acid levels in the ocean are 30% higher than they were pre-industrial times. Pre-industrial times is before the Industrial Revolution, which was in the 1700s, but still 30% higher acid levels in the water. Can't be good for the fish we're eating anyway. Number 15, life on the land. A fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with nature is essential. That's what they're saying in this report. Escalating forest losses, species extinction, and land degradation pose severe threats to people and to the planet. 100 million hectares of healthy and productive land is being degraded every year from 2015 to 2019. That is the equivalent of 2 times the size of Greenland. Greenland's big area. 100 million hectares. I should try and do some comparisons with the US or maybe in New Zealand or parts of the world. I'm estimating that's bigger than Texas. Don't quote me on that because I don't know the exact numbers, but 100 million hectares is going to be pretty ridiculously large. The world is facing the largest species extinction event since the dinosaur age. So we're going to have more species becoming extinct every year since the dinosaurs got taken out by the giant asteroids. So that's really sad. It's really sad that we are contributing to the extinction of other species in the world on a daily basis. I'm not trying to depress everyone here, crikey, but this is the reality of the report and of what we're looking at right now. So sustainability goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Conflict-related civilian deaths have increased by 50% in 2022. Again, fueled by the war in the Ukraine, but still not okay. And 2021 saw the highest number of intentional homicides in 20 years. 2021, more people were deliberately killed in 2021 than in any other time in the last 20 years. 458,000 people were intentionally killed by other people in 1 year. 9 out of 10 victims were male, which is an interesting one, interesting stat. But yeah, sad. So 458,000 people were intentionally killed by other people in 2021. So peace, justice, and strong institutions. It's not a good spot to be. Partnerships for goals. Number 17, partnerships for these goals. So many developing countries are facing a debt crisis right now. They've loaned money from the other countries or from the World Bank. And as of November 2022, 37 of the 69 poorest countries are in debt distress or high risk of it. So that means these countries could go bankrupt and their currencies and things will no longer exist, or they'll be so invalued that they can't afford to buy anything, devalued. And the official development assistance funding. So we talked about developed nations helping support less developed nations and funding them and supporting them. Their funding has dropped by more than 20% in the last 2 years. So on a positive note though, the official development fund for assistance from 2021 has been increased by 15.3%, but it does say that's mainly on refugees and aid for the Ukraine. So I believe the US has spent $200 billion in aid for the Ukraine so far, or probably not just aid, to be fair, probably weapons and things too, but they've been supporting considerably. So there you have it, the latest UN Sustainable Development Goals report as of the data from June 2023. I did say July earlier, it's June 2023. Basically the people and the leaders of the world are not doing enough, and the slide is continuing. and it's scary. It's scary. There's a film from 2006 by a guy called Mike Judge. It's called Idiocracy. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's supposed to be a dark comedy with some satire in there, and a reflection of what society would be like in the future. It's scarily how accurate it's becoming. Like it's funny but sad and scary. Idiocracy. Yeah, this is the state of the world, right? Well, not right now, but where we're heading. Okay, I'm going to segue off onto that from the UN Secretary General in July of this year. In September of this year, we had Climate Change Week in New York, and the UN Secretary General was at one of these events, and he called an address for urgent action. I wonder if this even made the news in some countries. It's a good question, right? So he warned that inaction on climate change was leading to dire consequences, including extreme weather events and mass displacements of people. And we know that's true. If you look at the flooding and the fires that are going on all over the world, earthquakes, the world is starting to push back, and this is impacting humans and our lives, and because of the choices we've made over time. So Guterres, he called for a climate solidarity pact to hold major emitters accountable and urged wealthy countries to support emerging countries in weathering the crisis. So it's a bit of the same rhetoric. I'm trying to be impartial, but didn't we just talk at the beginning of this? The 2015 Paris Agreement was, hey, we need to do some things better here. These are the sustainable development goals we need to work on and improve, and what are we going to do about it? And now we're in September 2023, and he's saying we need to sign a new document that's holding these guys accountable. And then he's created a thing called the Acceleration Agenda, which pushes for faster climate action, more climate justice, and the fulfillment of financial commitments. Businesses and financial institutions are urged to commit to net zero emissions and just transition plans. So that means even if you run a small business, potentially you could look at the emissions you're generating. I should be looking at the emissions I'm generating creating this video, the power I'm using and the power I'll use to upload it and post it onto YouTube, the videos that you watch on YouTube and that you watch on your phone. They're all consuming power, and if that power is not using sustainable energy or renewable energy, then you are creating carbon footprint, and that carbon footprint has, however small you may think it is, an incremental impact on the environment. And so you've got to look at ways to reduce your own emissions, me included. When I say you, we need to look at ways to reduce our emissions and what impact we're having on the world from our own personal choices. And I'm going to get even more complex now with you guys and try and explain some of the details of what I've been talking about. I'll try and get into the little technical terms of what I've been talking, because I've been talking about a lot of different terms, and I wanted to talk to you about understanding climate change and sustainability. And what we're talking about here is, ironically, the COVID-19 pandemic created a positive outcome for our planet. When the humans were getting hammered and passing away and being locked down at their own houses, there's a company called the Rhodium Group, and they track greenhouse gas emissions, and they sent some very interesting insights on this. So there was an increase, obviously, but then there was a sharp drop in emissions during the 2020 pandemic. So carbon emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, reduced during the COVID-19 pandemic. So they have gone back up again in 2021, but only slightly. But then now we're in 2022 emissions. They're looking at reviewing that. It's an increase again of 1.1% increase. So not as high an increase as you'd think. So greenhouse gas emissions worldwide are still going up, rather than us reducing them to improve the planet. The equivalent of 50.6 gigatons of CO2 into the environment, into the atmosphere. I don't even know how big that is. I can't give you a colloquial relevance to what 50.6 gigatons is. It just sounds ridiculously massive. That's how much carbon was emitted into the environment and the atmosphere in 2022, and it increased from 2021, and I imagine it's increased in 2023. So the fluctuations in emissions was influenced by disruptions in global energy markets. Again, the war in Ukraine had an impact on that, with how people consumed energy and what energy sources they were using. So there's a lot of gas lines going through from Russia to Europe and through the Ukraine into Europe, and that was impacted. So there's much more combustion of fossil fuels. So I mentioned it earlier, countries like New Zealand were increasing their imports of coal and burning coal in their own country, which there must have been a better way. There must have been a better solution with the money they have than spend on other things. In 2020, CO2 energy emissions worldwide declined by 4.8%, and some other major economies experienced even bigger reductions, but it bounced back, didn't it? After the COVID pandemic, 2021, they bounced back by 4.7% and went past pre-pandemic levels. So the pandemic reduction only happened for a little while, sadly. It's varied among a bunch of countries, but India and the US were seeing increases in emissions, and Russia experienced a significant reduction in emissions because of all the sanctions by all the other countries on Russia. They haven't had the same output of carbon emissions, which is interesting. It's essential to understand where emissions come from. Industry and the electrical power sector are the top contributors in 2021. So nearly 60% of all the global emissions in the world come from the industry and electrical power sector. So the electricity that we use in our homes and in businesses, and then the industry itself. So the manufacturing of things, those contribute to 60% of all the emissions in the world. So before we continue, I'm going to go into some specific terms about this landscape, right? So I've been talking about all these different terminologies and different statements about sustainability, climate change, CO2 emissions, carbon emissions. What does it all mean? So climate change encompasses both global warming driven by human-induced greenhouse gas emissions and large-scale shifts in weather patterns. Sustainability focuses on current meeting of needs without compromising future generations' ability to meet their own needs. So we can meet our own needs without trying to destroy the planet for future people. That's what sustainability is all about. That covers economic, environmental, and social aspects of the world. So that's what I hope that made sense. And then the next one is the IPCC. So I haven't talked about the IPCC much. It's part of the UN. The UN have created this as the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. So their job, all this data and all this information I've been blurting out about, metric tons of this and that, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, they assess climate science, impact risks, and mitigation options. So these guys are essentially, and girls, when I say guys, this team of experts assess climate science, and they're knowledgeable, and they are the ones measuring and understanding this and giving us the data that tells us what the risks are and how to stop it. Net zero. What does net zero mean? How am I going to be net zero? What's my carbon footprint, etc.? Net zero refers to balancing greenhouse gas emissions with the removals from the atmosphere. So what we're talking about there is, for all the greenhouse gas emissions you create, you've got to balance that with how you remove them from the atmosphere to create a net zero environment. So what we're talking about there, so imagine if I scale that down to, rather than a global perspective, I do like, for me to be net zero in my day, I need to measure all the different things that I consumed, either partially or actively myself, or impartially, and calculate what that carbon emission footprint was, and then to balance that out, I need to work out how much of that emissions, or how much of those carbon emissions can be reduced with, or offset potentially, with the environment absorbing that carbon and changing it So like, yeah, trees, for example, planting trees. Maybe if I planted a tree a day, it would reduce me to a net zero human. Maybe. I don't actually know. Greenhouse gases. What are greenhouse gases? Greenhouse gases are gases that are created and they get trapped in the Earth's atmosphere. And the primary example why we always talk about carbon footprints and carbon emissions is carbon, CO2. But there are other gases. So nitrous oxide, which is NTO, methane, which people complain about the dairy industry a lot in New Zealand. Methane, cows that release methane. Those are all greenhouse gas emissions, but they use carbon as the universal currency for that. So if you talk about, like if you look at money and the exchange in the world, people equate what their dollar is back to the US dollar. So we look at the amount of methane. Methane is 17 pieces of methane is the equivalent of 1 carbon, for example. So they calculate that back to one overall measurement of carbon emissions in the world to understand greenhouse gas emissions and carbon. Yeah, I hope that made sense. Yeah. So the Paris Agreement. What do we talk about the Paris Agreement? We know that Paris Agreement was an agreement signed in 2015 by 193 nations to get global warming below 1.5, or stop global temperatures increasing by 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. There's also the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So this is where businesses are getting under pressure to provide information on climate risks and opportunities for investors. So that's another UN group that's been created. COP. I talked about COP a lot. So the COP Summits is an annual event where the parties around the world from different countries, 193 UN member countries, come together and they look at climate change and crucial ways of achieving goals for the Paris Agreement. So in 2028, COP28, we're not in 2028 yet, COP28 is going to be in the United Arab Emirates, and it'll be a milestone for assessing progress, and it's going to be the first time they have what they're going to call the global stocktake. So we've got 5 years, and they're going to do a global stocktake, and that report I read to you earlier with all those failures, they're going to be reviewing that again in 2028 and saying, have we improved on this? Are we going to fix it? And align that to some climate actions and the Sustainable Development Goals. We know the UN Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015, and they're a global commitment to end poverty, safeguard our planet. But when we talk about different parts of the world, we can talk about the Race to Zero. The Race to Zero is a worldwide campaign where people, businesses are uniting cities, investors, regions, and they're trying to have a mission to become a carbon neutral future where they create jobs and sustainable growth at the same time. And then net zero. Net zero is was birthed, by the Paris Agreement, and it means striking a balance between greenhouse gas emissions and removal of those emissions, reducing emissions, and capturing or offsetting the remaining emissions. Carbon neutral. Carbon neutral is attained when an entity or product or activity offsets its greenhouse gas emissions to zero for a defined period. That's kind of what I was trying to explain earlier when I talked about me and the amount of emissions I generate as a human in a day, and how much of those emissions I can reduce and offset, so I'm creating a zero carbon emission. Carbon neutral. I will be carbon neutral. Carbon dioxide equivalent, so CO2e. CO2e is the unit that I talked about earlier, how they measure global warming or greenhouse gases over the course of 100 years. That's what they're talking about. When I talked about metric tons, 50.6 gigatons, that's the CO2e, carbon dioxide equivalent. And that's what I was talking about when I meant all the greenhouse gases are created under one universal measurement or unit of measuring. So achieving net zero requires a lot of strategies of removing CO2 from the atmosphere, natural and technologically ways with different risks and benefits. We're talking about how we can offer initiatives to reduce emissions, producing entities that support projects that cancel or remove carbon from the atmosphere, like tree planting or regenerative agriculture. We talk about a science-based target initiative. So this is something that countries and companies all around the world should be looking at. There's actually called sciencebasedtargets.org is the website you could look at. I don't know if I'm supposed to mention a company or things on my site, on my channel, I'm not sure, but if you look up science-based targets, this talks about how they've collaborated with different governing bodies around the world, and they're trying to validate and publish carbon reduction targets, and businesses can set themselves goals and objectives to reduce their carbon emissions and footprints. And that's the whole thing here, is it's so huge. All of these challenges I've talked about are so huge that we need collaboration and to work together to help reduce those. So science-based targets relate to climate science and Paris Agreement goals combined to maintain that sustainable future. So if we understand those terms, hopefully I explained those terms well. I'm not sure how well I did. If you understand those terms in the landscape, then we can start working towards creating a sustainable future together, and people working together to do it. And the basic stuff people do at home, and things that people get upset about, burning of fossil fuels, for example, is an industry. That energy consumption. Be responsible about your own energy consumption. Do you need to send that video? Do you need to drive to the store? Can you ride your bike? Can you walk? All those different things. Do you have a green car? Do you have an electrical car, or do you have a car that combusts fuel and burns carbon into the environment, into the atmosphere? So there was a UN Climate Ambition Summit that came about in September 2023, and that was, as I mentioned, in New York Climate Change Week in September. What we're talking about here is that a really interesting event but as a sobering reality check that extreme weather was displacing millions of people. We had wildfires in Hawaii, for example. Global emissions were high. Coal, oil, and gas contributed to 75% of the global crisis. People at the summit will present themselves as movers and doers and leaders committed to accelerating change. And what I think, if you're going to take anything out of the end of this video, is that people are trying to make changes, leaders are trying to make changes, but they can do more, and governments can do more, and average Joe consumers can do more as well. So this summit was real focus, and this summit there was 5 key takeaways, the 5 key things that I wanted to highlight to you from the summit. So this was a summit. It's called the UN Climate Ambition Summit. It was in New York in the US of A in September 2023. First takeaway was that it said that time is up. We can't keep saying we're going to do something. We have to do something now. Half the world's population live in danger zones, facing 15 times higher risks of climate change and impacts than ever before. The era of global warming is over. It's now global boiling. That's what UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said. We need to have a no-nonsense approach. So people who are saying, oh, I can't really do that. Greenwashers are people that tell you that they're doing things to reduce their carbon footprint, but really they're not doing much at all. They're doing the very bare minimum, and I can't name businesses and corporations on here, but there's large corporations worldwide that say, oh, we're going to offset all of our emissions by such and such a date. Offsetting doesn't solve the problem. Offsetting is me planting some trees to help counterbalance what I've done today. You need to reduce what you're doing as well as offset to actually get to a level of carbon neutral. Otherwise, I could burn all sorts of carbon emissions, or burn all sorts of fuels and carbon emissions, and just create a ton of that going into the environment, and then I can plant a bunch of trees and go, those trees offset all of those emissions. So it doesn't actually do anything. It's just cancelling out what you've done on that day. You need to reduce your emissions and offset to reduce that. So greenwashers are bad. Companies out there that are telling you that they're doing stuff to be net zero, look into it a little bit more and ask some more questions. There's no excuses anymore. Many nations are stepping up, but risk reduction strategies need to be increased. Climate action acceleration needs to increase. People need to actually start doing things instead of just saying they're going to do something. We need some ambitious government leaders. I mean, we have had some governments that have been more left-leaning across different parts of the world in recent times. They haven't actually inputted many policies or impacted or changed things as much as they would like, or we would like, or what we need to do. And that's why major emitters need to present progress reports to the UN, and they need to start looking to become net zero as much as possible and create net zero targets and support a green climate fund, which is the fund that helps assist developing countries. Number 4 is set goodbye greenwashing. So I talked about greenwashing once already, but they've got to adhere, businesses need to adhere to UN standards. So that's why I talked about science-based targets. There needs to be some general stuff in there where we're looking at the credibility of what people are saying and saying, are you actually phasing out your fossil fuels? And look at science-based actions to help improve the environment. And then number 5 is quite a crucial one. It's climate justice. So justice means considering the smallest polluters burdened by the biggest emitters. So what we're talking about there is that decarbonisation, high emission sectors need to protect people from climate disasters. And there's countries out there that are considerably higher emitters than others. And they're developed countries that are comparatively wealthy, and they're not helping the countries that are developing, and they're not doing enough themselves to reduce the overall percentage of emissions that they're generating. So what is the importance of the 1.5 degrees Celsius? I talked about Celsius a bit through this and the Paris Agreement. Like, that's the target that's set, right? If we don't fix that, then the ice caps are going to melt more, the sea levels are going to rise, we're going to have more weather events. Those things are not going to change. They're going to get worse. And so what we're talking about when we talk about that number, by 2030, if we don't reduce the temperature or stop the temperature increasing by 1.5 degrees Celsius or more, the difference is going to be having 70% of our coral reefs in the world versus 90% of our coral reefs in the world, 99% of our coral reefs in the world. Our pollinators, so our bees and insects that pollinate all the plants and the crops that we eat and that we live off, if we don't do it, half of their habitat will be gone by 2030. The Arctic Ocean in 2030 will have no ice anymore. The polar ice caps will be there still, but the ice sheets that the polar bears go through in the summer, won't be there anymore. They'll be gone. The entire sea level across the world will rise by 1 meter. That's about 3 point something feet. It's quite high. That's across the world. That's how high the sea level will rise. So you won't be able to send TikTok videos of yourself on the beach anymore, because the beach will be underwater. 6 to 16 million people will be affected by the sea level rise by the end of the century. I mean, that's a long way away, 2100, but 16 million people will not be able to live where they're currently living. So what do we mean by 1.5 degrees Celsius? I talked about this earlier. So 1.5 degrees Celsius is 34.7 degrees in Fahrenheit. I talked to you and I said Celsius was more accurate than Fahrenheit. Celsius was developed by a Swedish man called Anders Celsius, funnily enough. And Fahrenheit was invented by a German man called Daniel Fahrenheit. So named after themselves, both of them. But while both of them measure temperature, scientists have gone backwards and forwards and analyzed this, and the scale for Celsius and temperature was more precise than the scale for Fahrenheit, which was agreed, and the world, except for the US, places like the US, all switched to Celsius for a measurement. So most of the world use Celsius for how you measure a temperature, which is why the UN uses it and why we're talking about 1.5 degrees Celsius. But if you want to convert that, and you want to do a calculation to convert it to understand it, if you convert Celsius to Fahrenheit, you multiply it by 9, divide by 5, and then add 32. And if you want to convert Fahrenheit to Celsius, you subtract 32, multiply by 5, and divide by 9. So I've done it for you. So when we talked about all this stuff we've been talking about, and the environment, and the atmosphere, the average temperature in the world increasing from where it is now by 1.5 degrees Celsius. That means 34.7 degrees in Fahrenheit of an increase. Seems high. Seems very high, doesn't it? Scary. That would be the average temperature rise across the world. I don't think that's right. 34.7 seems too high, doesn't it? That's what the calculations are saying. So that's how scary it is. So that was the world famous in New Zealand YouTube channel. 1 hour of me talking to you about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, carbon footprint. It's the 4th of October 2023. I hope that was informative. If you made it to the end, to the 1 hour, and got some value out of this, I'm really glad. I hope you did. It's been tough to talk non-stop to you on the camera for an hour or so about all of these things, but I think it's important to talk about these things, and I'm going to break these things down in more detail and shorter, more succinct imagery, graphics and numbers, and explain what's happening with the world, and hopefully you'll find it informative. And then every now and then I'll do something funny. Every now and then I'll call out someone, some leader in the world, on how badly they're doing, or maybe how well they're doing, because I've got to be impartial in this, and I really don't want a channel of people trolling and hitting banter at each other, or insulting each other and offending each other. I want this to be fun and informative, and we're all here for the greater good, to treat each other equally with respect, and help each other make the world a better place. Gosh, that was thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you again. Okay, awesome.